welcome to History Undone, Mythbusting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we choose a chapter from history and I sit down with one of our experts to talk through some of the most common misconceptions, and we'll cover a few surprise facts you might not know too. Now today we're exploring the role and impact of Italian forces during the Second World War. Often maligned as cowardly and disorganised, is it time we reassess the legacy of the Italian soldier in battle? Well, I'm delighted to be joined from the US by the military historian Dr Walter Zapotoczny, author of The Italian Army in North Africa, a poor fighting force or doomed by circumstance. Dr Zapotoczny, welcome to History Undone Mythbusting.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
I just wonder where this idea of the Italian soldier not being very good or being badly led or being a bit of a butt of people's jokes, where does that come from, do you think?
Well, I think the myth that Italian soldiers were inherently cowardly or incompetent during World War II stems from a combination of factors. Wartime propaganda, some strategic failures, some misrepresentations. Allied propaganda during the war, for the most part, portrayed Italian forces as weak and inefficient. And that was partly strategic. All armies did this, but it was designed to demoralize the enemy, bolster Allied morale. Italian military defeats were often highlighted, and contributions of the soldiers were downplayed. Some of the performance of the Italian army early on, certainly led to that. Their experience in the Greek campaign. It was poorly executed, badly led. They didn't have the right equipment. And of course the Allies took the advantage from a propaganda standpoint to really highlight that, and spread that word. Even in North Africa, while the soldiers themselves, and I guess we'll talk about that a little bit, did a pretty good job. They were poorly equipped, again, poorly led. And so these factors led into it, And then there's this idea of culture reinforcing that the Allies are better than the Axis. They're kind of lower in a way, than the Axis. The Allies are fighting for right, fighting for truth, fighting for freedom. The members of the Axis weren't, and those types of things. So I think a lot of that had to do with it, and it just builds and I guess it's the old adage: if you say something enough times to people, they tend to believe it, whether it's true or not.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how propaganda that begins during the war to boost morale ends up kind of perpetuating through the decades, even to the present day. Well, let's get into your 5 myths. You've picked out 5 for us about the Italian forces during World War II. And number 1, I suppose this is a really big one. There's no messing around here. Let's tackle the idea that the Italian army was cowardly and in disarray. What is the truth, Walter?
Well, the reality is that, this is one of the most pervasive myths, as you suggest. And when you talk to a lot of people about the Italian army, the first thing they think about is that they were cowardly or ineffective. The reality is not that. The Italian 132nd Orete Armored Division fought with distinction during the North African campaign, particularly in El Alamein. They gave the British a rough time, and they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they still performed very, very well. Rommel, in his diary, said that the Italian soldiers disciplined, sober, an excellent worker, an example to the Germans in preparation for, dug-in preparations and so on. While the Italian army soldier lacked training, it was not for his stick-to-itiveness and his ability to fight that caused the problems. Again, equipment, lack of the right kind of equipment, poor leadership. You have to remember that the senior leaders, and to some extent the medium-level leaders in Italy, were promoted by their willingness to join with Mussolini's party. It wasn't so much their military expertise, where you find in the British Army and American Army, you're promoted up by your ability. Not that there's not politics at the very extremely high level, but certainly a little bit lower than that. If you're not able to lead men in combat, you're not going to get promoted. And that was not the case with the Italian army. commander-in-chief, the British commander-in-chief of the Middle East, had complimentary things to say about the Italians' soldiers' performance. He said they were willing, unselfish, good, and even Time magazine wrote after the North African campaign that they were good fighters. In many cases, the Fulgar parachute division fought to the last round, to the last man. So, I think, again, it goes back to propaganda. It goes back to this idea that they were not as good, and it fostered this idea throughout that they were cowardly, and it's just not the case. Not to say that some people didn't fight, and that's true in every army. There's certainly examples of it in the British and American, and certainly in the Russian army. Stalin stationed party operatives behind the lines with pistols to take care of anybody that came back. We didn't do that in the American army or the British army, but that happened. And why did that happen? Because people were cowardly, if you will, and they ran back. So it happens in all armies.
I was going to ask you about that, because why is it, do you think, that the term cowardly has been applied to the Italians when, as you say, Walter, I mean, you could apply, there are cowards, sadly, in every fighting force. And, okay, you could argue that maybe the Italian soldiers weren't as well trained as other soldiers, but, you can be a brave, bad soldier, and you can be a cowardly, good soldier, can you not?
Well, certainly. Again, I think a lot of it has to do with propaganda. And of course, the Italians didn't win the war. We won the war. And the history is written by the victors. And we're certainly not going to talk about the American Army and the British Army and the French are not going to talk about the problems they had with their troops. They're going to talk about what problems the Axis had and the people they defeated had with their troops. That's just the reality of what's in the history books, We all grew up reading the history books, and, those books are not lauding or complimenting the efforts that the Germans or the Italians made throughout the war. It's just the opposite, of course.
Very true. It's like the classic Churchill quote, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And I suppose that is a case in point.
That's a very good case in point. In fact, I have a T-shirt with that saying on the back of it.
Well, let's move on to myth number 2 now, and this is all about military leadership. Now, interestingly, you think it's not true that the Italian forces were poorly led, across the board at least?
I think across the board they were not. Again, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier about how commanders at certainly the higher level were chosen by Mussolini. One of the problems that the Italian army had, and was similar to the German army later in the war, is that Hitler and then, of course, Mussolini felt they knew more than the generals did, more than the tactical leaders did about how to run the troops. And when those decisions that came from Mussolini in this case got filtered down, some people were just shaking their heads and saying, this doesn't make any sense, but the boss says we have to do it, so what are we going to do? And now so the buck stops with the leaders who forward the troops, So they often get blamed for the errors and the mistakes and the forced maneuvering that came from the top. We certainly saw that in Nazi Germany. And it hasn't been as discussed as much with the Italian force, because so much of the emphasis of World War II, the study of it at least, has been with the Germans, But it's certainly true with Mussolini. It was true with the Japanese as well. The Germans, the Italians had this idea that the middle level leadership, the senior NCOs, non-commissioned officers, couldn't make decisions on their own. They weren't smart enough, or they weren't trained enough, or whatever their reasons were. So they had to go higher for those decisions to be made. Well, battles don't wait. Situations don't wait to get an answer back from some senior leader miles and miles away. And I think it all just manifests into this idea that somehow the Italians were poorly led. Some of the leaders should not have been there. I think to some extent the military had been weakened too by their involvement in the conflicts in Ethiopia and Spain, Albania. There wasn't enough money to properly train many of the leaders, many of the troops that were not even chosen by Mussolini. And so this all kind of leads into it.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, I accept the point about how propaganda has kind of denigrated the Italians over the years, and how maybe perceptions of Mussolini shape perceptions of the Italian military leaders. And yet, the same doesn't seem to apply to the Nazis, where, Hitler receives a lot of criticism for his military strategy, and yet individual military leaders such as Rommel come out of the war with their military reputations enhanced. Why is that not the case with the Italians? And are there individual military leaders in the Italian side who do deserve a kind of, I don't know, a fresh look?
Well, I think they do. There's some that do. I don't think the studies have been are there to really support that. They probably should be. We need to start looking. We need to look at those leaders a little more closely. Again, the Germans get a lot of attention. The Nazis get a lot of attention because of the power and what they did and how everything was permeated, the whole society and so on. And so I think in some cases the Italians were kind of looked as kind of an after effect here, or off the side, you know what I mean? But in their own sphere, in their own areas, they played a significant role, of course. But there certainly are leaders that I think, that deserve some attention. They really do.
I mean, just to throw one name at you, people talk about General Meze. Would he be worthy of kind of a second look?
Yeah, I think he would be. He was respected by the Allies and the enemies for his tactical ability. There's no question about it, But again, these names, in the history books, if you will, these names are secondary. These names, even if they're mentioned, a lot of people don't know anything about them. But we know much more about many of the German leaders, because the emphasis is there, has been there,
And I'm right in saying with Meze that he was one of the few people to actually early on say, look, Operation Barbarossa is going to be a disaster.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, he wasn't the only one. There was other leaders in the Italian force that said that too, but it was like, we've all seen the stories, we've all seen the pictures of the German generals standing around the table, and Hitler's there at the map table, and he's pointing, and this is the way we're going to do it. Everybody's scared to death. They're afraid to say anything. Don't challenge the leader, because you might not last. And I don't know that Mussolini would have done exactly what Hitler did in that regard. However, he was a strong leader, and he demanded respect, and he demanded his generals to listen to what he said. And that all causes a culture of leadership that may or may not support the best tactical or strategic decision. Many of them had second thoughts, but what do you do,
Well, let's come on to myth number 3 now. We've established that the Italian forces in World War II were more courageous than maybe a lot of people think, and they were maybe better led than a lot of people think. What about equipment? Because there is also this sense, Walter, that they were poorly equipped.
Well, and that's to some extent true, but not all of their equipment was poor. It was not all subpar. The Beretta M1938 machine gun was well regarded. And the Italian Navy fielded some excellent warships. One of the problems with the armor, for instance, was that Mussolini didn't trust, he was deeply distrustful of foreign companies. So he gave Italian companies like Fiat, others, the task of building equipment. Well, Fiat, while they were a monopoly in vehicle production, did not have a lot of experience in building armor. And they wouldn't listen to what even the Germans were telling them. So they built, I would have to say, inferior equipment. And then they fielded it, and some of it just didn't work right. And so I think it's a mix, but it comes from the top. It really does. And a lot of it has to do with Mussolini not willing to accept even advice from the Germans. And the Germans built pretty good equipment. He wasn't even ready to accept some of that, Their Italian equipment was certainly inefficient in many cases and inferior to the tanks, let's say, fielded by Germany, by U.S., by Britain. But again, if you're not willing to listen, if you're not willing to invest the money, and if you're not willing to to do what it takes to build good equipment, and you field that, then your troops are stuck with it. You know, a good example, Italian troops didn't even have field kitchens in North Africa. They had to bum food from the Germans. They weren't even cooking their own food, you know. It wasn't that they couldn't cook their own food or didn't know how to do it. The field kitchens weren't there. So some of it is just logistics, too. It's just logistics. Ammunition didn't work right.
Yeah, and to what extent were they also disadvantaged? Because Italy at the time didn't really have a big industrial base in the way that Germany had, and Britain had, and the Soviets had.
Well, you're exactly right. Italy was not ready to go to war when Mussolini declared war. But he felt, since France had fallen, he thought the fall of the UK was imminent. You know, he needed to be part of it, part of the spoils, you know what I mean? It probably would have taken Italy another couple years, realistically. Again, if they would have listened to different design ideas as well, and they had the resources and funding to really get ready to go to war. They went to war prematurely. Not necessarily with bad equipment in all cases, but not enough of it, and prematurely. And not enough training on how to run it either. I wrote another book about the Italian Decima Flotilla Mas, which was the Italian frogmen. And they had some pretty good equipment, and I know we're not talking about them as far as the Italian army, but just as a bigger picture of what Italy was able to do. I mean, they were precursor to Navy SEALs, to the British undersea forces, and some of the equipment that they developed was state of the art and really out there, never been developed before. And much of what undersea warfare does today came from them and came from their equipment. So it's not like they didn't know how to build good equipment, you know. A lot of it, again, has to do with funding, a commitment to design, and willingness to put it into the field.
Yeah, and in the naval sphere, of course, I mean, a lot of Italian ships wreaked havoc on the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, which a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of.
Absolutely. The undersea force in the Mediterranean, the Italian undersea force in the Mediterranean, was a major headache for the British. Major headache. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is because a lot of people don't know much about that, you know, and I wanted to get that word out a little bit to whoever's interested in that aspect of combat.
And just on the point about some of the arms that they did have that maybe were better regarded, I mean, things like the Beretta machine gun were quite well regarded, were they not?
They were, yeah, very much so. So again, it's not like they couldn't make good equipment. Did they have the funds to make enough of it? And in some cases, they should have gotten some of the designs from the Germans and other places.
Okay, well, let's move on now to myth number 4 about the Italian forces during the Second World War. And let's widen this out from specific military engagements into the geopolitical sphere. And I know something you're very keen to emphasise, Walter, is that it's sometimes underappreciated the extent to which the Italians were spread right across North and East Africa and also the Balkans and Greece and even Russia. They were all over several theatres of war.
Italy's defeat in Greece in 1940 is often cited as evidence of incompetence, but the broader strategic impact of Italy's entry into the war really helped stretch the British and Allied forces resources, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. And whether the fact that the Italian forces did not have a significant impact, and you can't pick a particular battle where they were overwhelming, they tied up Allied forces. I mean, they really did. And that was a major thing. And that in and of itself was a major accomplishment. A lot of people don't realize that the Italian army played a significant role in the German Africa Corps and made up a large portion of it. Italy had 18 infantry divisions, 2 armored divisions, 2 motorized divisions, and a paratroop division in North Africa. In fact, by July 1942, when Rommel was kind of at his peak there, and it was really running the British crazy, the combat power of the Panzer Army Africa comprised 66% Italian personnel, almost 250,000 troops, 57% Italian tanks, 57% Italian artillery, and 55% Italian aircraft. So we think of Rommel, we think of the German Africa Corps. It was mostly made up, or a high percentage of it was made up with Italian troops and equipment, you know?
That's a really good point. And it also kind of raises the question, well, okay, let's say in a parallel universe, Italy never got involved in the Second World War and they're not there. How does that change the German calculations?
Well, it does change the German calculations, and they would have certainly had to have placed resources differently than they did. And I don't know that, well, you know, Hitler was hell-bent on invading Russia. There's no question about that because of, you know, the obvious reasons. He wanted to expand the German sphere and more land and get rid of subhumans, as he categorized them, Jews and Slavs. So would he have launched Operation Barbarossa when he did, had he not had the combat power available to him? I mean, that's something we can debate. You know, I don't know. But there's no question that by Italy joining forces and providing the manpower and equipment they did, it played a significant role.
Well, 4 myths down, 1 to go. Let's come on to myth number 5 about the Italians during World War II. And this is sort of takes us back to our first myth and this suggestion that somehow the Italians were cowardly. And specifically, this is this myth that the Italians were more likely to surrender or to be deserters. Just tell us a bit about why this is a myth in your view.
Well, there were instances of mass surrenders, but there were instances of mass surrenders in every army. Again, you know, the stories are written by the victors, but particularly later in the war, this occurred. And again, it occurred later in the war in other armies as well. Often it happened because of overwhelming odds, you know, against them, lack of supplies, orders from high command, rather than individual cowardice. In some units, Italian units continued to resist long after their position became untenable. For example, Italian troops in North and East Africa fought for months after the Italian surrender in 1943, and many soldiers resisted German occupation, you know, after Italy had switched. A little known fact about the Italian army, we can talk about that a little bit more, but is the Alpine units. I mean, they fought very bravely, and they were very capable, you know, so again, it goes back to propaganda. I think it goes back to the willingness or the desire to demonize the enemy, demonize National Socialism, demonize fascism, etc., etc., etc. So it's very easy to call them cowardly. When I say in my book, you know, was it cowardice or was it were they victims of circumstance? And I really believe, having researched it, they were more victims of circumstance, the soldiers, than just being cowardly. It's easy to call somebody a coward until you really know what happened, you know.
Yeah, it's a good point you raised about the Italians in East Africa. I mean, that was the Gurkhas they were facing. I mean, the Gurkhas have a fearsom reputation, and they were saying that the Italians were pretty much the most fearsome enemy they'd faced because they kept fighting on.
And they fought on in many cases to the last man, smaller units, and with no more bullets, and wouldn't surrender, you know. Is that cowardly? I don't think so.
They sound almost a bit more like the Japanese in that sense.
Yeah, well, Japanese were a little far out there, further down the road of not willing to surrender. But yeah, in many cases that's the case. Well, I think a lot of the Italian soldiers bought into to Mussolini's idea of fascism, of what that meant for a future Italy, as did many Germans in terms of National Socialism. So, you know, when you are supporting and you believe in a cause so strongly, you know, what are you willing to do to promote that cause? And in many cases, in the eyes of the soldier, that means fight whatever it takes.
And just before we come on to your true fact, Walter, that we're going to end things off with, I wanted to talk about the Italian artillery, which did have success. And I mean, the gunners developed a reputation in some parts of being even more efficient than their German counterparts. Yeah,
that's right. They were. And one of the things that the Italians did was do a lot of training in artillery. Getting back to the whole training idea, though, I think another thing that I think surprised me when I was doing the research, and I just never thought of it, The Italian army was trained prior to Mussolini declaring war to fight in the mountains. They were trained to fight. They were mountain fighters, okay? And now you take these, and they were using artillery very effectively during that training. Now you take that mountain-trained force and put them into the desert. Totally different. British struggled with that too early on, when they first went to the desert. It's different. Americans struggled with it when they went there because they weren't trained specifically for it. One of the lessons we learned in the United States, and we shifted to our training to fighting in the desert when the decisions were made to go into Iraq and Afghanistan, But yeah, it is different. But the artillery, they spent a lot of time training, and there were some pretty good artillery pieces that they were able to use and put into effect.
Well, there we go. 5 myths about the Italians during World War II, expertly dispelled. Before we go, Walter, we always ask our guest every week to give us something that maybe most people don't know that's actually a true fact. And you kind of referenced this earlier about the Alpini, so tell us a little bit more.
Well, they were highly respected for their mountain warfare capabilities. They were elite troops, and they played a significant role in several campaigns, particularly in the harsh environment in the Soviet Union. Again, when one reads about Operation Barbarossa, what happened in the Soviet Union, I would challenge you to show me anything in the history books that describes the Italians in that fight. But they were in that fight, and they did pretty well. And this unit did an outstanding work. Despite being poorly equipped for winter warfare, they gained a reputation of resilience, of courage. During the retreat from the Don River in early 1943, they helped break out of the Soviet encirclement, which at the time was considered impossible. But yet they were able to save a large amount of their troops and German troops that followed them by their ability to fight as they did to break that encirclement. So it wasn't, they weren't cowards, but they realized they had to get out of there, And the Germans said, okay, well, you're pretty successful at this. We're going to follow you along. And they did. And they saved a lot of lives. They were able to operate in extreme conditions, difficult terrain, and they were highly trained for it. Again, trained to fight in the mountains. That was their whole mantra at the time, Italy's mantra before the war, But they were dedicated and they were skilled. And again, if you read about Operation Barbarossa, you're not going to find too much about any references to the Italian aspect of it, but they were an integral part. They were involved early on there too. It wasn't like they came in after, towards the end,
Well, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, your book's brilliant book's called The Italian Army in North Africa, a poor fighting force or doomed by circumstance. And I think what's quite interesting from this conversation, Walter, is it seems like research into the Italians during World War II just isn't as extensive as it should be, and maybe more needs to be done.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And one of the things I try to do in the books I write is write about things that a lot of people don't know much about. And that, I think it's somebody needs to get that word out there and have people look at it from a little different perspective, perhaps, So much of history is written. I teach history at a local community college, and, and kids now at that level are just coming out of high school. Okay, this is like their first college experience out of high school. And we go through these things, and they say, no one ever told me that in high school. I didn't know that. And that's the sad part. And I don't know if you experienced that in the UK as well, but in the United States, we just don't delve into many of the aspects of history that cause us to learn from the mistakes of it, so we don't repeat it. And I just try to do that in my classes, and I've tried to do that with some of the books I've written.
Well, this has been genuinely fascinating. Dr. Walter S. Zapotoczny, thank you so much for joining us today. And we will be back busting more historical myths very soon. So if there's anything you want to see deconstructed, let us know in the comments. And remember to like this video and subscribe to History Undone with James Hanson. Goodbye.